Well, the first Trump-Clinton debate is behind us, and the thing that struck me so much about that first debate was not so much what Donald Trump said to Hillary Clinton, but rather what he did not say. So let me give the conservative response to many of the points that Madam Clinton made and just kind of went unanswered.
First, we have to build an economy that works for everyone, not just those at the top. That means we need new jobs, good jobs, with rising incomes. We also have to make the economy fairer. That starts with raising the national minimum wage and also guarantee, finally, equal pay for women's work. I also want to see more companies do profit sharing. If you help create the profits, you should be able to share in them, not just the executives at the top. How are we going to do it? We're going to do it by having the wealthy pay their fair share and close the corporate loopholes.
Wow, Hillary, so many falsehoods in so little time. So let's start with the $15 minimum wage argument. Now, some cities like Seattle have instituted a $15 per hour minimum wage law. Turns out that small business owners, the kind of people that actually pay minimum wage, did not reluctantly lurk down to their underground money caves and come up with more sacks of gold stolen from the workers. Because $15 minimum wage results in the loss of jobs. People cannot afford to pay this, so the hours of existing employees are cut back, jobs are taken away, people are fired. In fact, if you look at something like McDonald's, when they demanded $15 per hour minimum wage, then you get an automatic kiosk to take people in and take their orders, and everything just basically disappears. So do the jobs. A minimum wage job was never supposed to be a living wage. It was designed for people, mostly teenagers, to basically get started in the job market, and it's a place to start your work resume and not end your work resume. Now, as far as unequal pay for women, the old 80 cents on the dollar argument, well, that's a gigantic lie, and you know it, Mrs. Clinton. Now, it is true that if you average all of the male salaries and all of the female salaries, men do make more than women. And the reason that they make more than women is because they put in longer hours at higher paying and often vastly more dangerous jobs. The idea that someone at Walmart could say to a woman applicant coming in for a job that the job pays $35,000 a year for men, but only $27,000 for you, sweet cheeks. Well, that idea is absurd, and it's also illegal. It's been illegal for decades, but needless to say, knowledge of and obedience to the law doesn't seem to be one of your primary virtues. Now, as to your idea of profit sharing of corporate earnings, I think that's absolutely terrific, and I fully support it. As a matter of fact, right now, in the middle of your hometown of New York City, there's a place where workers can right this second own pieces of a company's profit or their losses. It's called the New York Stock Exchange. They've been practicing this radical progressive idea since May 17th of 1792. That's 224 years now. So you might want to update your files a little bit. I'd be happy to shoot you an email about it, but promise me you'll keep it under your hat, won't you? And finally, the central issue of your party's shameful class warfare rhetoric can be demolished with a few simple facts. And here it is. The top 1% in terms of income pays 45% of all tax revenues. Let's be crystal clear that everybody heard that. The top 1% of income pays almost half of all of the income taxes in this country. The bottom 35%, the bottom third of Americans essentially, pay no income tax at all. So you are, in fact, absolutely right, Hillary. The rich do not pay their fair share. They pay far more than their fair share. And if we taxed them less, then that money would go to invest in real businesses and create real jobs instead of going to politicians in Washington who gin up envy and resentment in order to achieve the power and the money that they are either too stupid or too lazy to go out and get on their own.
Remember where we were 8 years ago. We had the worst financial crisis, the Great Recession, the worst since the 1930s. That was in large part because of tax policies that slashed taxes on the wealthy, failed to invest in the middle class, took their eyes off of Wall Street, and created a perfect storm.
You left out a few things here. Back in 1977, Democratic President Jimmy Carter passed the Community Reinvestment Act, which was designed to put money back into poorer neighborhoods and communities. Not a bad idea. However, over the years, the government eventually forced banks to write mortgages to people whose credit and income would not otherwise have qualified them back in the good old days of sound and reasonable risk-reward calculations. Now, when the government essentially guaranteed bad mortgages, they completely changed the incentive structure of banking. Banks no longer cared about making sensible loans to people who could pay them back because the government was going to pay off even the bad loans. So now the smart play for a bank is to write as many mortgages as possible. And when Republicans repeatedly pointed out this growing danger throughout the mid-2000s, Democrats called them racists who hated the poor. So Democrats caused the problem, then Democrats took credit for solving it, which, as near as I can tell, is in fact pretty much the entire history of the Democratic Party.
Take clean energy. Some country is going to be the clean energy superpower of the 21st century. And here's what we can do. We can deploy 500 million more solar panels. We can have enough clean energy to power every home. We can build a new modern electric grid. That's a lot of jobs. That's a lot of new economic activity.
You're actually going to trot out this old saw again. Didn't President Obama promise us unlimited prosperity from this new green economy miracle 8 years ago? And didn't he promise it again 4 years ago? Matter of fact, didn't President Obama take $500 million of taxpayer money, that's $500 million of your money, and give it to a solar cell company called Solyndra? And didn't $500 million of your money go poof after Solyndra then went bankrupt? Mrs. Clinton, your party is so financially stupid that you poured money into a company that went bankrupt after you stole $500 million from the American people in order to prop it up. Solyndra went bankrupt because the entire idea is bankrupt. Renewables do not scale up to even 5% of our country's total energy needs. You know that. As a matter of fact, the giant Ivanpah solar plant outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, is very heavily touted by your party's president, sucked up another $1,500 million of your money, and now we find it's not able to run without continued government subsidies. Why? Because the electricity generated by the giant Ivanpah solar plant in Nevada costs about $200 per megawatt hour compared to about $35 per megawatt hour for clean burning natural gas. Now, what's worse, much worse than these taxpayer-funded experiments in economic failure is that you Democrats do everything in your power to prevent access to cheap, homegrown American energy. You won't let us build new nuclear plants using abundant meltdown-proof thorium reactors, and you won't let us mine the coal under our feet or drill for the oil under our feet or frack the natural gas under our feet. Cheap, abundant energy costs in America would combat the cheap, abundant labor costs of places like China. But despite your talk, you don't care about bringing jobs back to America, because if you did, those people would get rich and then they'd start voting Republican. Instead, you say that we have to commit economic suicide and condemn generations of people, in fact, entire cities, to poverty and crime and hopelessness because of climate change. So let's talk a little bit about some undisputed historical data and not computer models that have to constantly be readjusted in order to comply with, reality. Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the Cretaceous period, let's say about 80 million years ago, the center of what is now the United States, Kansas, let's say, was not 2 inches underwater or 2 feet underwater or 20 feet or 200 feet. 80 million years ago, Kansas was under 2,000 feet of water because the polar caps had completely melted. Now, current CO2 levels are about 400 parts per million. People like Mrs. Clinton are having conniption fits about it getting to 450 parts per million, but back 80 million years ago, CO2 was not 10% higher than it is today. It was 1,000% higher at about 4,000 parts per million. And there were ferns and trees and pterodactyls and plesiosaurs in Kansas. That was 80 million years ago. Here's the point. 80,000 years ago, that exact same spot in Kansas was not under 2,000 feet of water, but rather under 10,000 feet of ice. 10,000 feet, that's 2 miles of ice. How much ice is that? Well, imagine a jetliner in the distance flying over Kansas. They're at 30,000 feet, so 1/3 of the way up there, solid ice, 1/3 of the way up to the airplane. Now, my question for you, Mrs. Clinton, is this: whose coal plants and whose SUVs and whose private jets caused this somewhat significant climate change? I'll wait. Mrs. Clinton, The Earth's atmosphere has negative feedback mechanisms that stabilize temperatures because if it didn't, well, Earth would have burned to a cinder or been frozen into a solid ball of ice a billion years ago.
Well, I think cybersecurity, cyber warfare will be one of the biggest challenges facing the next president because clearly we're facing at this point two different kinds of adversaries. There's no doubt now that Russia has used cyber attacks against all kinds of organizations in our country, and I am deeply concerned about this.
No, I'm sorry, no. You're just not going to get away with that, Mrs. Clinton. If you're deeply concerned about spying and cyber warfare and information leaks, then you would not have posted secret, top secret, and above top secret information in an unsecure server in your basement where anyone, and I mean anyone and everyone, even individual hackers have come up with some of this information, let alone agents with the resources of China and Russia. They've obtained the most sensitive, detailed information about America's diplomatic stance, about our military assets and their state of readiness, about our global strategic plans, not to mention the names of intelligence assets that would be actual, real people who are going to die now or soon be killed because you wanted a private email server that was not subject to Freedom of Information Act requests. You utterly, criminally disregarded federal law so that you could sell State Department influence to the tune of about $1 billion of criminal activity in the Clinton Foundation and a personal fortune of at least $100 million for a lifetime of public service. If you cared about our nation's security, you would not have misplaced or lost no less than 13 personal devices, personal mobile devices, each one loaded with classified information. You would have just lost them, and you most certainly would not have lied directly to the American people time and time and time and time and time and time again about just how badly you have damaged this nation's security for personal monetary gain. Now, there's a word for people who sell their nation's security for personal monetary gain, and you and I and the American people all know what that word is, don't we?
I have put forth a plan to defeat ISIS. Our military is assisting in Iraq, and we're hoping that within the year we'll be able to push ISIS out of Iraq and then, really squeeze them in Syria.
Hillary, while you continue to hope to squeeze them in Syria, ISIS is busy murdering people in Paris and Brussels and Orlando and San Bernardino, and almost every week because of you, innocent people are dying. They're dying because of you. You created ISIS, you and President Obama, because when President Obama took office, ladies and gentlemen, back in 2009, Iraq had been stabilized and there had not been a single American killed in Iraq for 5 months. But you, as Secretary of State, were unable, or more likely unwilling, to conclude a simple status of forces agreement in Iraq. I say unwilling, Mrs. Clinton, because we have damn near 100 of these things with countries all around the world. However, you and the President announced that we would be leaving the Iraqis all alone, and within a very short period, the defeated, scattered, ragtag remnants of what had once been AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which had been defeated, utterly destroyed by American troops during the Iraq War, you let them become ISIS. And worse than that, you could have stopped them at any time. But you and the President didn't, because you couldn't face the political humiliation of putting boots back on the ground in Iraq after you took credit for pulling them out. And they grew, and they grew, and they grew because you created them by not leaving troops in Iraq. And if that's such a bad idea, by the way, Mrs. Clinton, we've had U.S. troops stationed in Europe for 60 years, and we've had troops stationed in Korea for a little over 50 years, and you refused to do it for 5. You launched an unauthorized war in Libya. You armed and have had American aircraft fly air cover for Al-Qaeda. You may remember Al-Qaeda from their appearance 15 years ago in Lower New York. Oh, and your husband, by the way, had at least one chance to kill Osama bin Laden before the attack, but he declined on the advice of White House lawyers. I think we've had enough lawyers in the White House for a while. Under your direction, Mrs. Clinton, the State Department has become so incompetent that when you first met the Russian ambassador, you gave him a toy box with a big red button marked reset in Cyrillic letters. Only it didn't say reset. They got it wrong because you and your State Department were so arrogant and uninformed that you could not correctly translate one Russian word in front of the entire world in order to make a bad joke. Everything that you've touched overseas has turned into a disaster, and given what you've said here earlier tonight, it seems pretty clear to me that if you were given the chance, the same catastrophes would start to occur right here at home.
The other day, I saw Donald saying that there were some Iranian sailors on a ship in the waters off of Iran, and they were taunting American sailors who were on a nearby ship. He said, if they taunted our sailors, I'd blow them out of the water and start another war. That would not good judgment.
Mrs. Clinton, you are absolutely 100% totally and completely wrong here. And it isn't just more incompetence and arrogance. This attitude will cost American and Israeli lives, many lives, because history shows us again and again and again that tyrants and dictators constantly test what they feel to be decadent democracies for weakness. You want to know what is the most heartbreaking statistic, in fact, in all of human history? It's simply this. World War II didn't really start in 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland. It started on March 7, 1936, 3 years earlier, when, contrary to the Treaty of Versailles, Adolf Hitler sent a small number of German troops into the demilitarized Rhineland. After the war was over, the Allies had access to the internal records and memos of the German OKW, that's Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. It's essentially the German High Command. And we have found memos from the German High Command saying that had those troops met any resistance, a company, a squad, a marching band, maybe even a single policeman who steadfastly refused to get out of the way, any resistance, and the German generals would have shot Hitler, and 50 million lives would have been saved if we'd only shown this much courage and this much resolution, this much. So when Iranian gunboats, or Russian fighter jets for that matter, come dangerously close to U.S. forces in international waters, that's a test. And if we back away from that test, we'll do the same exact thing that was done with Adolf Hitler. We'll move back, and there'll be a more dramatic test, and a more dramatic test, and people like you will go back and back and back and back and back until finally war is inevitable. I would immediately declare that any unauthorized enemy vessel approaching within, let's say, half a mile of a U.S. warship will be given one warning shot, and if they continue to approach, they will be sunk. As president, I would pre-authorize the destruction of any vessel that came within 1 inch inside of that exclusion zone, because we have to stop fearing going to war with Iran, and we have to have Iran start fearing going to war with us. See, I could do this all day. This is what it sounds like when you not only believe in this country, but you also love it enough to do the hard work of reading history and psychology and economics, weapon systems, and all the rest. The country deserves somebody who's not a traitor, a pathological liar and a felon, or an unprepared, thin-skinned egotist to fill the toughest and most important job in the history of the world. We need your help to keep these messages coming. If you want to help us make a difference, please go to billwhittle.com and become a member.